Some of you may be surprised that I'm making such a short video in response to a reasonably profound question. Someone has written in asking me, why am I an anti-communist? I'll read that letter in just a moment. Obviously, I could give a very long answer. Research into the history of communism has been a significant part of my adult life. I could also make a whole separate video about the fact that communism was a significant part of my childhood, but that's a story for another day. I've studied the history of communism in Russia, in China, but of course, most notably, I think for many of my viewers, you're aware that I've studied the history of communism in Cambodia and Laos, among actually other examples. In preface to this video, I'll just say I've often been in a difficult position, especially when talking to older people who don't get it, who can't appreciate my perspective. The fact that I am an anti-communist, the fact that I'm a critic of communism, the fact that I reject communism as a philosophy, as a political movement, and otherwise, does not mean that I applaud uncritically American foreign policy. Not at all. So Cambodia, in brief, is one of the worst disasters in the history of communism. It's also one of the worst disasters in the history of American foreign policy. It's both. The fact that you know it's one type of disaster doesn't mean you would ignore the extent to which it's another type of disaster. And right next door, Laos is, a really interesting contrast. Laos also is one of the worst disasters in the history of American foreign policy. And although you could say communism has been a bit of a disaster there, it was a much less dramatic, much less extreme disaster than Cambodian communism. So it's rarely mentioned on the lists of the greatest atrocities, the greatest body counts, or the greatest examples of mass starvation caused by communism. So turning to the question I've gotten a question from a guy named Ben, who is a 21-year-old student living in Ireland. He writes, I've been following your channel for about a year now, and have found your output engaging and stimulating. I've recently become increasingly interested in left-wing politics and have spent a great time studying the thought of Marx and Engels and those who continued their line of inquiry. With all these letters, I do actually skip a little bit. I compress a little bit what these people have said to me. He then mentions that he actually read my article, Robert J. Lifton and the Self-Directed Cult. So, all right, I'm surprised. Thanks for reading that article. That's not one of my most popular publications, but that's actually an examination of both communist thinking and other forms of cult-like thought with some comparative statements, some of the cult-like aspects of historically real communism. He asks, I would like to know briefly your reason for being anti-communist. It's very rare to find somebody who isn't extremely right-wing taking that position. I'm curious about opposing views because I'm not fully satisfied with all the conclusion of many left-wing thinkers. I understand the historical reason for being anti-communist very readily. What I'm interested in knowing about is what it is in far-left thought that you're in disagreement with philosophically. So, end of statement from this person who wrote into me. And by the way, I appreciate, thank you, he's donating the $1 a month to support me via Patreon. I encourage all of you to sign up also. You too can send me questions and I'll make videos in response to them. Now, the body count of communism, the millions of deaths through persecution, through violence, through war, through civil war, the censorship, the refusal to allow democracy, the refusal to allow freedom of speech, all of those things are tremendously important, but they're not what I mentioned first and foremost in response to this question. The most fundamental, succinct, and important reply I can give for why I am not a communist and why I am anti-communist. Looking at communism as a philosophy, as an ideology, as a chapter in the history of political science, communism asks the wrong questions, and it does not have any of the right answers. Of the two parts of that statement, the most fundamental and most important is the claim that they're not asking the right questions. I do think that you can participate in a school of thought or a philosophy, you can be an adherent or you can be a proponent of a philosophy simply because it is asking the right questions and it may not have any of the right answers. I think that today, if you were engaged with Theravada Buddhism, another philosophy I know a lot about, did a lot of research on, etc., I think it would be possible to really be an adherent and a proponent of Buddhism simply on the basis of the fact that you believed it was asking the right questions. And some people in India and some people in Africa have actually converted to Theravada Buddhism, have become involved with the religion and the philosophy because they felt that way. Now, what questions might you latch onto in Theravada Buddhism? Many people in India actually latched onto the anti-rich elements of Theravada Buddhism, like communism. That's why I mentioned here in parallel that the critique of the attack on the privileges of the wealthy, of the elite, they latched onto the anti-racist, anti-caste system elements, which are there from ancient Buddhism. Ancient India had its own racist conceptions, its own elitist philosophies, and you get counterpoints to those philosophies within the ancient canon of philosophy of Buddhism. Some people in Africa, I think, were interested in that too. So attacks on the privileged, attacks on the elite, and the attempts of that religion in its own terms to, in some sense, be promoting the interests of the poor and the downtrodden, which it's inconsistent on. I mean, Theravada Buddhism is not a revolutionary philosophy. It's not a utopian social philosophy. It never offers to destroy the inequality of rich and poor and to replace it with something better. But nevertheless, those elements are there, and those questions are being asked. Whether or not within Buddhist philosophy you find really useful answers to those questions, whether or not you find a better social system to replace the social system we've got with. So in many cases, simply having the right questions is enough to pull people in, is enough to sustain a political philosophy, a social movement, etc. It's enough to sustain faith. Because unlike communism, Buddhism is quite open about the fact that it relies on faith. I think that communism in many ways also appeals to and relies on faith. So my rejection of communism in that fundamental philosophical sense can just be summed up with that and nothing more. It asks the wrong questions. It gives the wrong answers. If you want to read several hundred pages expanding on this, Karl Popper is a philosopher of science, who devoted many, many pages in a book called The Poverty of Historicism to looking at the philosophical roots of communism and what he calls historicism, the attempt to fetishize certain episodes in the history of Europe, particularly the French Revolution, and how that formed the foundation for Marx and Engels, the philosophy they presented, the theory they presented, and then the permutation of that philosophy under Lenin in Russia. Now, in real-world terms, so I recognize that question. He really asked me to speak to the philosophy, not to the historical reality, the episodes of what actually happened in Cambodia, or France for that matter, or Japan. Japan has its own bizarre history of communism, believe it or not, or China, or what have you. In terms of the glorification of and whitewashing of communism, I think it is tremendously important to face up to just how terrible communism was under Lenin. Many people wish to remember Lenin as a relatively good leader in contrast to Stalin in a later period of Russia's history. The reality is, and this is one of the things that's sort of most forgotten or most ignored, Russia had elections in the year 1917. It was in the last couple of months in 1917. I think November of 1917. I often remember them as the elections of 1918 because the convention of the elected representatives, the first parliament, happened in January of 1918. That parliament was allowed to exist for one day. And after that, the Bolsheviks, who lost the elections, who got, as I recall, under 25% of the vote. So they would have been a minority member of parliament. They would have been a minority party within parliament. They hunted down and killed one at a time the elected representatives from all of their parties. So one of the, most fundamental criticisms of American foreign policy when America was engaged in active anti-communist covert ops around the world was that America itself did not have enough faith in democracy being able to tolerate diverse opinions such as communism. That is a very true and very deep-cutting criticism of American foreign policy. And Laos is an example of that. In Laos, America could have allowed the country to have a democratic parliament, which they had at one point, and to have a parliament where communists were a minority party, where they were one voice among many, debating the future of the country and espousing their views. America should have allowed that, and in many ways, communism would have lost its mystique, it would have lost its edge, it would have been just another party in the House of Parliament that had opinions about taxes and improving the roads and expanding the electricity network and all the pragmatic day-to-day activities of government. They could have been standing in that parliament debating those things as equals with other parties who had different views within a democratic system. And actually, Laos is an example. There are many, if you're interested in Latin America's history or other countries of the world, where America felt they could not tolerate that, and America covertly, we're primarily talking about the CIA, but other CIA, State Department, other organs of American foreign policy, but especially, the Dulles brothers at that time, John Foster Dulles, etc. They shut down that parliament. They prevented that from happening. And they really forced the country into a civil war situation where the communists became an armed opposition in exile with their own zone of control, fighting against the government of the capital city, etc. And that's a pattern that played out around the world, partly because America wanted that way, or at least the Dulles brothers, certain people who were very powerful within American foreign policy, wanted that way. That is very sad. However, you can't overlook, crucially, that in the history of communism, starting already with Marx and Engels, the refusal to allow democracy, the refusal to allow the fair contest of contrasting opinions that is actually built into communism. It's evident in Lenin, when Lenin decided to shut down that parliament and instead ultimately hunt down and kill every representative of the winning party, the Socialist Revolutionary Party, who were themselves far left-wing. They're called Social Democrats or Socialist Democrats in historical retrospect, but in any other context, they would have just been considered a rival Communist Party. They're called the Socialist Revolutionaries, for God's sake. They are far left, but the communists in Russia were especially brutal in hunting down and killing their close competitors that way. They didn't want to have another legitimate political party representing the future of communism, future socialism, having contrasting opinions. They didn't want to have a parliament. They didn't want to have open debate. And built into the philosophy of Marx and Engels, you have to look at how they responded to, how they built their own philosophy on the historical experience of the French Revolution. And in many ways, their opinion, both Marx and Engels right at the beginning of this process, was that the French Revolution was not violent enough, was not extreme enough, that it should have gone further in its extremist tendencies. So talk about not learning the lessons of history. Marx and Engels, from the start, embraced the notion that violence is the only way to progress in the history of the world. And yes, some of those ideas they took from little bits and pieces of Hegel, but that's much exaggerated now in retrospect. If you actually look at how much, Marx in Das Kapital, Volume 1, he has almost nothing in common with Hegel. But people like to point to this idea as being a Hegelian idea, and Marx, the amount of time those guys spent going over the details of the French Revolution is much more important to the progress of their thinking. But these are people who embraced an historical path of violence, and they thought they were going to live in a period when the contest between communism and capitalism became more and more violent, and that violence, not democracy, not debate, not the free interplay of ideas, was going to be the only way for this philosophy to progress. And in that one aspect, as I say, it's already in Marx, it's already in Engels, of course it's already in Lenin, but we don't even have to talk about Stalin or Mao Zedong or Pol Pot. We don't have to get into Cambodia or these other even more extreme examples. At its core, this is a problem with communism that totally vitiates and totally invalidates anything else in its philosophy that might be worthwhile. And for a contrast, Theravada Buddhism does not have that problem. And Theravada Buddhism also appeals to some of these sentiments in humanity of wanting to be pro-poor and anti-rich, to challenge established elites, to challenge feudalism itself, if you like, whether you're looking at an aristocratic society or a capitalist society in which there's an elite of wealthy people who are almost aristocrats, whatever your social circumstances may be. And it has to be said, Karl Popper mentions this briefly too in his critique. It's very interesting to point out the extent to which even Catholicism in the modern world appeals to the same sentiments as communism, that very often Catholics justify their faith, justify what their religious organization is doing in terms of advocacy for the poor, helping the poor. So communists never had any exclusive claim to those sentiments, to those bases for their social movement. But although Catholicism is also guilty of atrocities on an unbelievable scale, I think you can argue that that's not built into the core philosophy of Catholicism. Although I'm an atheist, I don't agree with Catholicism. It is very easy, of course, to argue likewise with Buddhism, with Theravada Buddhism, that massacres and this kind of violence and hunting down and killing people who disagree with you is not in any way built into the DNA of Theravada Buddhism. It's not in the core philosophy. It's not in the core political philosophy or social program. Not at all. On the contrary, Theravada Buddhism, in theory, you shouldn't even be killing insects. It's very anti-violence. Although in some ways it's resigned to violence being inevitable. That would be another video. So, yes, even in trying to constrain my answer, as requested in this letter from my Patreon supporter, it's very, very important that we recognize the role of violence in the philosophy itself. Not as a later corruption that crept into the philosophy, not as something incidental or accidental, but as a core issue and problem within communism from the first. And as bad as communism was, as I've said so briefly and vaguely, in asking the wrong questions and having the wrong answers, this almost ensured that it could not adapt, that it could not become a better philosophy with the passage of time, and indeed it didn't. And I'd encourage you to look under any heading, for example, agricultural policy. Why is it that this philosophy, on a macro scale, fostered such absurd notions under a smaller heading like agriculture? Why is it that they continued to have ridiculous, false, pseudoscientific ideas about agriculture, even when millions of people were dying, even when the consequences were so terrible? Well, again, part of that, the refusal to allow a democracy, the refusal to look positively on some kind of Socratic exchange of opinions, criticism, recognizing what's wrong and adapting your core principles. The very anti-progressive elements within communism from the first, already in Marx and Engels, already in Lenin, the same principles that led them to hunt down and kill not just people who disagree with them in an extreme way, not people who were, for example, monarchists, but of wanting to hunt down and kill a rival party so similar to the communists as the socialist revolutionaries, a tendency that, again, you can see in the history of China, the history of Cambodia, and elsewhere, where it's the people who maybe agree with them on 9 points out of 10 who are seen as the most dire threat to the Bolshevik party or whatever the ruling communist party is. That same tendency, which is hardwired into the philosophy, led to a refusal to ever accept of, recognizing, oh my God, we're promoting agricultural policies that instead of increasing the amount of food is resulting in starvation. We're pursuing economic policies that are causing whole industries to collapse and are leaving people without shoes. There are all these ridiculous. Sorry, I mean, go to the history of communism. There are ridiculous examples of that. So yes, these are very fundamental problems that you can find the roots of in the philosophy, but it's important that you don't examine the philosophy in isolation, because when you're looking at when the philosophy was put into practice, the defects of that philosophy become all the more evident to all of us. They become writ large, with enormous body counts, with some of the worst episodes in the history of human nature. And again, if you can't learn from that, in the same way that Marx and Engels really refused to learn from what went wrong in the history of the French Revolution, you're trapped in the same cycle of making excuses for some of the worst disasters in human history instead of recognizing the disasters, really learning from what went wrong, and then adapting and moving forward. And from my perspective, I mean, the failure of communism, the failures, plural, were so fundamental. I think there's absolutely no way moving forward in the 21st century that we can't. There's no other way to adapt other than discarding communism itself, root and branch, in principle and in practice.